Hi, my name is Kathleen Logrich from the Army Historical Foundation, and I want to welcome you to Remember D-Day, a panel discussion. Before we begin, I do want to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who is registered for today in case they want to review any information or questions or share with someone else. Now, to begin, I'll be introducing our speakers. Joseph Balkoski served for many years as command historian of the Maryland National Guard and the U.S. Army's 29th Infantry Division. He is the author of 8 widely acclaimed books on World War II history, including a 2-volume series on American involvement in the D-Day invasion and a 5-volume series on the history of the 29th Infantry Division in World War II. He was the founder and curator of the Maryland Museum of Military History at the Maryland National Guard headquarters in Baltimore, and served on the Governor of Maryland's Commission on Military Monuments, and was recently awarded the Maryland Distinguished Service Cross and Maryland National Guard Meritorious Service Medal for his lifetime of service to veterans, Maryland, and the Army National Guard. John Long is an alumnus of Roanoke College and the University of Virginia. A museum professional for over 25 years, he currently serves as Director of Education at the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia. He has written extensively about both World Wars and on the history of Southwest Virginia. He has also taught several college courses at nearby colleges. He is a contributing columnist for the Roanoke Times, co-host for the World War II history podcast, Someone Talked, and has served on the board of directors of the Virginia Association of Museums. Paul Morando began his career in the Army Museum program in 2003 as the director of Harbor Defense Museum in New York. In 2007, he became the director of the Casemate Museum in Virginia, and in 2011, he went on to be the director of the Quartermaster Museum at Fort Gregg Adams. In 2017, he became the chief of exhibits at the National Museum of the United States Army. He is responsible for the oversight of the design, fabrication, and installation of the museum's exhibits, as well as the artifact collection on display. In 2018, he supervised the design, development, and installation of the Nisei Soldiers exhibit, which he is currently developing into the Army's very first traveling exhibit, I Am an American, the Nisei Soldier Experience. Mr. Morando has a master's degree from City University of New York. And finally, our moderator for tonight's program. Charlotte Juergens is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, archival producer, and interdisciplinary scholar. She recently directed the documentary feature Sunken Roads: 3 Generations After D-Day, which is represented by First Run Features and premiered theatrically in 2021. The film follows her experience traveling with a group of D-Day veterans on a pilgrimage to retrace their route from World War II. As an archival producer, Charlotte's collaborations have included archival work for PBS and multiple museums and libraries. Her experience has also included 2 years at NBC News Archives, collaborating with documentarians and museum curators for public humanities projects across the world. Charlotte has a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Yale University, a master's from the University of Chicago, and is currently finishing up her doctorate from the University of Michigan. Next, I'll turn off my camera and hand over the reins to Charlotte to continue to introduce our panelists. Again, if anyone has any questions, please place them in the chat or Q&A.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that wonderful introduction. And many thanks to everyone who's tuned in and joining us tonight. Thanks also to the Army Historical Foundation for hosting this event and making all of this possible. So I'll start by just noting that for many of us, the 80th anniversary of D-Day carries some mixed or bittersweet emotions. On the one hand, it's an occasion to celebrate our veterans and honor their stories. But on the other hand, it's also a somber moment to reflect and remember the many D-Day veterans who are no longer with us. I'm just really grateful for this event as an opportunity for reflection in advance of the anniversary and as an opportunity to learn from each other. We have a really great group of panelists tonight, and I'm excited for the conversation. So to get started, we're all going to speak a little bit about our personal connection to D-Day, our involvement with past D-Day commemorations, and plans to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So I can start by sharing those details about myself. So my personal connection to D-Day is that my great-grandfather, Parker Davy Hanna Jr., was a D-Day veteran. And while I always felt connected to my Grandpa Pat's story, I really got involved with D-Day history 10 years ago as a 20-year-old college student. I had a life-changing opportunity to join a group of 90-year-old D-Day veterans on a pilgrimage to Omaha Beach for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And you can see here my Grandpa Pat, who kind of inspired that journey. Our film, Sunken Roads, is the story of that pilgrimage. And you can see here me and Don McCarthy, one of the veterans who's in the film. This is a production still from the film while we were on the ferry from England to France. And so during the course of production for Sunken Roads, I was lucky to kind of witness and participate in many ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary. So English and French and American ceremonies. And the film captures many of them. And so this year, to mark the 80th anniversary, I'll be very honored to visit the National Museum of the United States Army for a screening of Sunken Roads. And that screening will be the weekend before the anniversary on Saturday, June 1st at 2 p.m. And I hope to see many of you there. I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Okay, all right. Hello, my name is Joe Balkoski. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. You know, I reflected on my relationship with the history of D-Day in preparation for this tonight, and I realized that it's been with me, the memory of D-Day has been with me virtually my whole life. It really all began when I was 9 years old, and of all things, I attended a New York Mets baseball game at Shea Stadium on June 6th, 1964. And they announced on the scoreboard that it was the 20th anniversary of D-Day. And, you know, being a kind of a history nut, I was kind of into the Civil War centennial, which was going on at that time. That, you know, I didn't realize it, but it set my life in a certain path, which has not really changed. It several fortuitous circumstances got me going. I worked as a moving man during college, and the driver of my truck was a Ranger veteran who scaled the cliffs of Point du Hoc, and spent a lot of time in that truck talking to that man. And you know, it really all began with me on the 40th anniversary. Sometime in my mid to late 20s, I knew that I wanted to write a book on D-Day, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this throughout this broadcast tonight. But I realized that there was a need for a new approach on the history of D-Day because the thorough accounts of what actually happened had not yet been written when I was a young man. And innocent me, I thought I could start looking into that. And on the 40th anniversary, which, as you all remember, was the anniversary in which President Reagan gave his famous Boys of Point du Hoc speech in Normandy, that really is the moment that changed my life, because that was the time in which I started to establish very, very meaningful, and I mean very close relationships with veterans of the 29th Division who had landed on Omaha Beach. And that was 40 years ago, and it amounted to probably over 1,000 29th Division veterans, and only a handful are left, of course. But my friendship and bonding with those men, and I'll talk about this in more detail later on in the broadcast, but my relationship with those men is really how I came to devote my life to D-Day, and in a very similar sense to what Charlotte just said about her film. I lived in a very fortunate time where you could speak to these men when they were still young. I mean, I spoke to D-Day veterans when they were in their 50s, which is kind of amazing to me when I look back on that. So the story continues to the present. You know, D-Day has been with me since the age of 9, and it will be with me forever. And I'll leave it at that. And I thank you all for the opportunity to let me chat about it. So thanks. I'll mute myself.
I'll jump in ahead of Paul. If that's okay, I don't remember we discussed an order, but my main connection with D-Day now is being on the staff at the National D-Day Memorial, which has been a great honor. I've been here since 2015. And so this year will be our second big anniversary. Of course, June 6th every year is a big commemoration for us, but every 5 years, if the anniversary is divisible by 5, then it's just takes on added meaning. And so the 75th, which you see here in this picture, was a just an immensely rewarding experience for me, and look for the 80th to be the same, with the difference that there'll be fewer veterans, and we already know that. We're preparing for that eventuality. My memory, there's Carlos Showalter, an Iwo Jima veteran, who was one of the ones in attendance in 2019, a personal friend of mine, so I threw this picture in. But my personal connection to D-Day really also began in 1984. I was between my junior and senior years in high school, and remember watching the coverage of the 40th anniversary, and as Joe mentioned, the Pointe du Hoc speech by President Reagan. I can't remember if I watched it live or a recording later, but I remember thinking this is a very good speech, and how interesting that the men were there and he could speak to them in second person. You did this and you accomplished that, and made me more aware of the World War II veterans that were really all around me. My father, who was in the Navy in the war, although never out of the country until long after the war was over. My my first boss, men I knew at church, neighbors, and started kind of not very systematically asking questions, trying to learn as much as I could. Went on to college, majored in history. One of my favorite classes was a history of the Second World War. I ended up coming back to my alma mater a couple of years later to teach that class. And one thing I required of my students at that time, probably couldn't pull it off now, unfortunately, but they had to do an oral history interview with a veteran of the war, which back then in the late 1990s was much easier than it would be now. But as a historian, just remained fascinated with it, and with the idea that we can speak to these guys, we can shake their hand. I will never meet a Civil War veteran or a veteran of the Peloponnesian War. To share a moment in history with this generation is just, let's say, it's been enormously rewarding for me. And I'll turn it over to Paul at that point.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. As the chief curator of the National Museum of the United States Army, I'm responsible for telling the Army's story through exhibits and artifacts, obviously, that are related to the history of the Army and soldiers. And we do that from 1775 to the present day. And we feature a wide variety of artifacts that are directly tied to individual soldiers. Now, for me, this June will be the first time I'll be involved in commemorating the anniversary of D-Day in a significant way. At the museum, we have public programs scheduled for that day, obviously, and for that weekend as well. So if you want to check out for more information or detailed information about that, please check our website. And for us, we will look at the significance of D-Day as told through the soldiers who served. Currently, in our World War II gallery, we feature key artifacts that are connected to D-Day. For example, we have an original Higgins boat that you see there, one of 8 that are tied directly to the Normandy landings. We are not sure as to what beach this one landed on, but it reflects, or we depict it in this scene landing on Utah Beach as part of the 4th Infantry Division. So I would guess my work on this particular display that you see here, doing research not only on the boat itself, but the soldiers who came down and the equipment, the weapons, the things that they carried really inspired me to want to learn more and be part of sort of commemorating D-Day. So it was working with those cast figures, trying to figure out how they positioned themselves on the net, where they were in the boat, really kind of, gave me insight into what these soldiers went through. And then the idea was to try to convey that to the visitors. And I think we were very successful in doing that. And in addition, we have beach obstacles in this gallery, as well as personal objects, helmets that you see here. For example, one I want to highlight is a rifle. You can go back to it, of Private Tehan. He was a soldier of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. And he jumped into D-Day, but was immediately killed. That Garand that you see there was discovered 72 years later. And they were able to properly identify it back to Private Tehan. In fact, his name is etched onto the butt of the rifle. And somehow that a farmer who found that rifle was able to get it back, first to a French Army paratrooper in 2016, and then later gifted to General Mark Milley, who was then the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. General Milley then transferred it to the museum, which we now have on display. And this month, we opened a brand new special exhibit called D-Day, Freedom from Above. I think you hit the next slide, Kathleen, which will be open until the 15th of November. Now, this exhibit is a little different from what we're normally used to doing. It focuses on paratroopers who landed and the events that followed afterwards. It's a very interactive exhibit where you use a tablet, where you are transported back to 1944. And for us, this is a great way to connect with new audiences who may never heard of D-Day or understand its significance. So we found a unique way to get new audiences interested in the history of D-Day, what it meant for us as a nation in the world. And so far, it's been very, very popular, not only with kids, but also adults as well. Thank you.
Thank you to you all for sharing that context. I hope that that helps to give the viewers a little bit of a sense of all of our backgrounds, what brings us here today, and also of what a interesting kind of interdisciplinary group we have here. So I'll start by sharing some questions, and I'm interested to hear your responses. And then after the end of the moderator questions, we'll shift to an audience Q&A. But as an opening question, I'd love to hear from you all about, from your perspective, why is it important to remember D-Day? Anyone can get started.
I'll go. One of the things about being a historian is studying the history of history. And it's very, very clear, obviously, that in my lifetime, the historiography of D-Day has changed and is continuing to change and will always change. And I was born at a point in the history of this country in which I just missed, by a decade or so, living Civil War veterans. So when I was beginning to become enamored of history, thanks to my mother, and the Civil War centennial, as I mentioned, it became obvious to me that we now were at, I was never going to talk to a Civil War veteran, as John mentioned. And, boy, that's going to change everything in terms of how you study and understand the subject matter. So I have, as I mentioned earlier, I've been a very, very fortunate person to have lived in different phases of the historiography of D-Day. And, As I mentioned, when I attended the ball game at Shea Stadium, it was the 20th anniversary, but nobody really cared about it back then. Nobody had written a truly scholarly book about what happened. There was, Cornelius Ryan had just come out with his book, The Longest Day, which, helped launch a new phase of the history of D-Day. But it took some time for the American public and the European public, of course, to understand the immensity of the event and to also understand precisely what had happened. And that's where, I launched my whole career, to help basically answer the question you just asked, Charlotte, which is, we have to remember it because the people who lived it deserve to have it remembered as it was. And of course, that's easier said than done because there were thousands of primary source documents to go through. I was very fortunate to have befriended hundreds, if not by now over 1,000 29th Division veterans and getting their story. It just was the perfect storm for me because I lived at a time when you had access to the primary source documents and you also had access to the people who lived it. And so the reason it has to be remembered in a nutshell, in my view, is that the men who we all love and honor deserve that it be remembered as it was. And that's my short answer to that.
Thank you, Joe. That's a great answer.
I am happy to endorse everything Joe just said. But I'll add that not just D-Day, but really all of World War II has so many lessons for our present time, as well as I would remind students very often, and students quite often on tours of the memorial, that we live in the shadow of the Second World War. That you can't really understand the international situation for the last 80 years without knowing what happened during that war. And D-Day, as just a 24-hour slice out of that war, was such a seminal event that I think it needs to be understood just to put things in proper context. As I often will tell students on tours, that this was one day out of the war, but it was the day that opened up a path to victory in the European theater. Not that we were going to win the war on June 6, 1944, but we're going to open up a door that will allow us to win it 11 months later. And if somehow D-Day were forgotten and the war just became this kind of blur of activities that you spend 5 minutes in sixth grade history class covering, I think again we would just lose so much understanding of the current world, as well as lessons that are of great value. Obviously, we're never going to storm the beaches of Normandy in the same way ever again. Warfare has changed, international politics has changed, so the lessons can't be applied in exactly the same way they might have been, in the Battle of Okinawa or something. But lessons on leadership, on organization of troops, on different tactics that don't really change over time. All of these, I think, need to be understood so that we can glean the lessons out of this that we might apply to a much different conflict in the future. In fact, I've been kind of watching and observing for a year now the World War II analogies that are made about the war in the Ukraine. Again, obviously a very different conflict, and yet somehow commentators always find a way to bring up the Second World War in discussing it. And the last thing I'll add why we need to remember, because it is really just a cool story. It's so compelling. There's so much to it. 24 hours, 5 beaches, and yet you will never exhaust all of the drama that took place, and all of the stories that happened to individuals. So it's beyond any lessons we might learn. It's just a rewarding thing to delve into.
Yeah, and if I could just add, obviously it's an amazing historical moment that cannot be overlooked. And as a curator of military history, I'm obviously curious about sort of the stuff, right? So I mentioned it a little earlier about beach obstacles, right? For the most part, just fairly benign type of thing, but we have a few of them on display to kind of convey sort of the conditions these soldiers are in when they're landing on these beaches, right? So these obstacles are laid out by the Germans to deter the landing craft from coming in, to make it difficult to land on those beaches. But they wound up being some of the only moments or pockets of protection for those soldiers, right? So they're hiding behind these, hedgehogs, as they're called, and just basically twisted metals put together. And if you've seen the photographs by Robert Capa or Sargent, you can see that famous image of these soldiers just trying to do whatever they can to hide behind these obstacles. And it's such a powerful image, and I think that gets lost on folks at how difficult it was to storm those beaches and what they had to go through those first harrowing moments of D-Day. So if anything, if an exhibit or a memorial just captures that, and visitors or whoever can come away with, well, this was an enormous sort of almost larger than life mythical experience for these soldiers, I think we've done our job.
Thank you for those thoughtful answers. So my next question is about the strategies that museums and memorials and historians use to narrate and honor veteran stories. I am interested to hear about, ways in which these strategies might overlap or might diverge from one another, like how much museums, memorials, and historians can learn from each other in this way. So yeah, I'd love to hear you speak about the strategies for narrating and honoring veteran stories in your field.
Well, I'll say something. I mean, I ran a museum for 30 years. But of course, it was a very broad subject museum covering the 1600s to the present day. But a major theme in the museum was World War II. I'm at the risk of repeating what Paul said. One of the ways you bring the modern visitor to bring their mind's eye to the subject matter is up through artifacts, and in the museum I worked in the Maryland National Guard headquarters, we had some very, very cool D-Day artifacts. And when we could relate them specifically to soldiers who had participated in the D-Day invasion, that was always something that, really grabbed the attention of the visitor. Again, at the risk of saying something very similar to Paul, one of the objects I had in my museum was an English penny. And I don't remember the provenance on this penny, but it was documented that it was found at the site of the first U.S. cemetery on Omaha Beach. And so therefore, I put that penny in a museum case, and I made a sign under it saying this penny was found at the site of the first U.S. military cemetery in Normandy, and who knows who owned it? And just think about it. But some soldier carried this penny onto Omaha Beach on D-Day, and you'd be amazed at how such a simple thing could grab the attention of even a kid. visiting the museum, and I'm not in the museum business anymore, so I'll pass on to my colleagues, but I will say that the World War II section of my museum was always the most popular one. So,
Yeah,
Well, the National D-Day Memorial is an unusual museum because it is almost entirely outdoors. So display we have some display cases in an education building, but not much, uh, given the size of the entire facility. So when you come to the memorial, what you experience is the memorial grounds, which are laid out very thoughtfully to describe a chronology, uh, mentioning, of course, the planning and preparation stage and the leadership, representing the crossing of the channel, giving due diligence to recognize the Navy, and I should say navies because we recognize all of the different nations that were involved. The air power component of it and how important that was, because I think, and if there is one problem, I don't know if it's a problem, but one shortcoming maybe of the way D-Day is remembered is that too often we only remember the beaches and we forget the paratroopers, or they come farther down the list. We forget the naval forces, we forget the airplanes overhead, not to mention, how many merchant mariners made this possible, how many, men fueling the aircraft back in England, and all these stories are a part of the bigger story as well. But we try to tell the story through very evocative sculpture that typically can get a great reaction from our visitors, from our water effects, where we represent the hedgehogs that Paul mentioned, jets of air that simulate bullets hitting the water as one of the sculptures struggles through. And as I remind school groups, that something like 156,000 men landed in Normandy on D-Day, and we have 4 of them here on our beach. So this is not the whole story, and we don't pretend it's the whole story, but it is representative. And I think by the end of a tour, whether it's a school group, whether it's a retired couple that just dropped off the highway to see what in the world this memorial was, I think people come away with a greater sense, not just of why D-Day was important, but the courage that it took to fight it, the leadership that it took to make it a success. And then, although by the time we get to the end of the story, our tours are often running long and have to sum up very quickly. But we hope that they go away with some sense of why this matters to you, why these men on the beaches in 1944 are still shaping your life.
Yeah, I think whether we're a museum, a memorial, or historian, I think our obviously job is we're all educators. We're all trying to educate the public in a variety of ways, right? Museums obviously exhibits and artifacts, but book talks, lectures, events like we're doing now. I think there's so many creative ways to kind of tell that story. We hosted a symposium not too long ago, focusing on D-Day. So museums can do more than just exhibits in telling and trying to honor soldier stories. And there's so many examples, not only at our museum, at the National Museum of the United States Army, but museums all across the world. So I think it's continuing to tell those stories, and not forgetting about, meaning that yes, 80th commemoration is important, but you still have to keep the story going beyond that, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be a weekend event. It could be just small little things, even just small little conversations, as kind of John mentioned in terms of giving the tour, and just a one-on-one conversation with a visitor who may have a question. You'd be surprised how far that goes with visitors or public, and having that one-on-one sort of interaction.
Thank you all. My next question is, looking back over the past 80 years, what role do you think that D-Day has played in American history and in American memory? And do you see that role as changing or evolving in the decades to come?
I'll start off. Yeah, I touched on this a little in my previous answer. I mean, how great it is that the four members of this panel are each representative of a different medium in trying to introduce the history of D-Day to the public. You know, we have a museum professional, we have one of the great memorials, military memorials in the United States with John and Charlotte, your film, magnificent film, urge everybody to see it. And me with the written word. I mean, I was into museum work mostly out of necessity, but my love from the very beginning was the written word. And that's how I have attempted to impart D-Day knowledge to people. You know, again, going back to my analogy of the Civil War, my long-suffering parents, you know, entertained me by taking me to the Civil War battlefields when I was a very, very young kid, and during the centennial of the Civil War. So as I said, it was a time in which you know, living veterans of the Civil War had only passed away, you know, 15, 20 years before that. And so how does one then, as a kid, you know, learn? And in my experience, you have to try to grab the public by entertaining them and informing them simultaneously. And with me, one of the most influential writers, probably the number one influential writer in my life, was a fellow by the name of Bruce Catton. He wrote of the Civil War in magnificent ways. I mean, Pulitzer Prize winner, highly, highly readable, human emotion throughout his pages. And, you know, he was writing at a time when nobody could speak to a veteran of the Civil War anymore. And consequently, he probably grew up knowing Civil War veterans, and he therefore took it upon himself to try to put in his pages the emotions of what he learned as a kid and as a young man. And he was incredibly influential to me. You know, and while I'm talking about him, another influential person was Cornelius Rhine, because I was about 9 or 10 years old when his seminal book, which really launched the whole history of D-Day, you know, and what would later develop into what we know now. So I guess my long-winded answer here is that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of skill to try to grab the public and not let them go. And believe me, I give it the best effort I can. But some of the great writers of our time, Rick Atkinson, for example, he's a real mentor of mine. He is a fellow who can write about World War II. And in his last book in the Liberation Trilogy, a lot of the opening of that book related to D-Day. Rick is a person who is the Bruce Catton of our modern generation. And I think will conclude by saying that when I was a young kid, the number of books on Gettysburg was barely approachable. You know, you probably could read most of them. And look what has happened in the last 60, 50, 60 years. The Battle of Gettysburg, which, you know, in a fairly decent analogy, D-Day is the Gettysburg of World War II. In the last 60 years, Gettysburg has been written about so meticulously. I mean, we now know about almost every foot of ground on that battlefield and what every regiment did, and magnificent what we know. You know, you could go to that battlefield and spend months and still not see everything based on the new scholarship that is now emerging. So this is going to happen too for D-Day. It certainly is, and I just feel I was honored that I was able to play a role in it, you know, at a relatively early stage. But as I always tell people when they say they enjoyed my books, I say, well, you know, what I started, when I'm long gone, you will see that the number of books written about Omaha Beach and all of the other beaches and the whole Normandy campaign are going to grow 1,000-fold. And we are going to know things that we don't know now. And I just feel honored to have played a role in that whole historiography of it. But I can guarantee you that if we succeed in educating and entertaining the public, a certain small core of people will get the bug, like we all have, and they will progress from the ground work and the foundation that we have laid. I don't know if that's makes sense, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, if I could jump in a little bit. Sorry, John.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think D-Day sort of role in American history is just, you know, showing sort of overcoming sort of insurmountable odds, right? I think that's kind of, you know, what I think a lot of folks can take from it. And to, you know, to Joe's point, you keep on figuring out ways to tell that story. So Charlotte, documentaries, films, a great way to kind of continue those stories in a new way. And I think it'll just, you know, obviously we're losing our World War II veterans, and so that personal connection is obviously going to go away. But you see that in the families of these soldiers. So you see that in people who are taking those stories that they learned by their family members, and they're continuing ways to try to honor them. And I don't think that will ever go away. And so it's just a different format, maybe a different medium, right? Or a different way to honor the service and sacrifice of these soldiers who participated in D-Day and who served in all wars to some degree. I think there's nothing wrong with changing how we remember what these folks did on D-Day, but as long as that conversation continues to happen, I think it'll be kind of a further explore what they actually did. And as kind of Joe was kind of mentioning, I don't think the story will ever go away.
I'll add that over the past, maybe not 80 years, because I think you can really date, you know, the publication of The Longest Day as the start of D-Day history, the way we know it. There were some earlier, you know, writings about, and certainly the Army had the Green Books, you know, dealt with it and such. But if we look at the way the history has evolved over that time and extrapolate it forward, one thing that I think will keep the attention of a lot of people, and certainly of, you know, historians, is the different perspectives that come along. And one example it seems that in a lot of the 1970s and 80s, a lot of World War II histories, in my thinking at least, just kind of gave too much credit to the German army, that they were this super effective, military force that we were lucky to defeat. And then along comes, one guy writing about the 29th Division who's saying the American fighting man was every bit the equal of the German, and his equipment was better in many cases. And that author was, of course, Joe Balkoski, who refocused that question in a lot of ways. And then you look at, and again, I guess the number of D-Day histories and World War II histories is just expanded exponentially, but it's much, I think, more common to get a more balanced view of the role of the American military, and as that goes forward, I think you will continue to draw a new audience, and we already see that a lot, because again, I'm a little bit different than some of you in that I work with younger kids very often, and some young kids are clueless and have no idea what you're talking about and aren't paying much attention, but others really are engaged, and that's a function of being a kid, not necessarily anything else. And I see several things that are engaging younger audiences that's going to be the older audiences in a few years. One is living history, reenactors. And I've talked to a lot of adults who say, I really got interested in this when I went to Conneaut D-Day up on the Great Lakes, or to one of your events at the D-Day Memorial where they had living historians. And the guy let me hold an M1 Garand and told me how it worked. And I think that's engaging a lot of people. And obviously some of that can be done well or poorly by the reenactor, but very often it's done well. And then another thing, and I almost cringe when I say it, but again, I see it all the time with kids, what's really getting a lot of young people, and young males in particularly, interested in World War II are video games. And I say I cringe when I say it because that's just a pet peeve of mine. Turn off your video game and go outside. But if I have a kid, say an 8th grader, raise his hand and ask about the benefits of one sniper rifle over another, I usually don't know the answer, but I say, you play video games, don't you? And if that gets directed in a way that's a little more academic, I guess, or a little more commemorative, I think we're going to see a generation coming up, and for that matter, also not the young kids necessarily anymore, because the movie's been out for a while, but Saving Private Ryan really focused the country's attention on D-Day and on Omaha Beach in particular. And a lot of people's engagement with D-Day started in a movie theater with that movie. And maybe 30 years before that, it was the Longest Day, engaging people, which is a great movie too, if you've never taken the 3 hours to watch that. But I think all of that is helping to drive the history forward, so that it's happening on the popular level, it's happening, on the academic level. And I don't worry that we're going to have a generation, that has forgotten D-Day. They may have different perspectives. They may have better perspectives in some way because new research is done. But I don't think we're going to come to a point where a lot of people just have no earthly idea what you're talking about when you mention D-Day.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, my next question is kind of inviting you all to kind of I guess, reflect on these same themes that John just brought up. So, John, I understand if you don't have more to share on this question, but really I'm curious about the challenges and possibilities of sharing D-Day's story with new and younger audiences who might never have had the chance to meet D-Day veterans or hear their stories firsthand. And, as a female filmmaker, I'm particularly interested in getting young women interested in D-Day's history. I think that there are a lot of young women who don't necessarily assume that military history is for them, right? And so I'm particularly curious if any of you have any thoughts about young women, but younger generations in general. Yeah.
Well, I'll touch on that. I mean, basically, the challenge for me is to do right by the veterans I have known. I feel a tremendous responsibility to do my job right because, these weren't just people I interviewed, and you well know that, Charlotte. These people became part of your life, and I used to tell people I probably led my generation in attending funerals because of all the 29er funerals that I attended. But no, I mean, basically, to this day, I feel I have a tremendous responsibility to tell the story that these people opened up their psyches to me. And you got to remember, when I first started doing this, they very rarely talked about it. I mean, a very common theme is that the families would say, "Oh no, my father never said a word." How many times have I heard that? It's 10,000 times. But somehow or other, I was able to impart to the vets that I was going to take responsibility and tell their stories honestly, truthfully, no holes barred. And I find that that's really how I present it to the younger generation, that this is the real thing. A bit of a sidelight, but you know, there are times in this long career I've had that you get in the dumps and you wonder whether anybody's listening, and everybody has that writer's block. But I've come to think, as crazy as this sounds, that history is a living, breathing thing. The men who I knew who did the 29th Division experience um, became a part of me. And again, Charlotte, you know what I mean from your film. Um, it's it just became very, very important to me to make sure that when they were gone, and how many veterans would cry in my presence, knowing that they were first getting it out of their psyche the first time. And, they were really telling it to me honestly. Um, I mean, emotions like you cannot believe. I get chills when I think about it today. But I mean, that's my answer. I mean, that I feel like I have to be honest to the people I knew and then tell the story to the younger generation exactly as I heard it, in a way that can grab them.
I'll just say, Joe, that really got to me as a 20-year-old when I first met you and heard you speak about those stories. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I will add, and I'm sorry that I kind of stepped on the toes of your question a few minutes ago, but I'll add, because you mentioned engaging females. You're probably right. If you did some sort of demographic analysis of World War II buffs, or maybe our visitation even, but you're probably going to find it kind of skewed toward the males. But D-Day, it was a male story. It was 156,000 men and one female journalist who may have snuck aboard one of the ships. But if you look at the bigger war, I think there are very powerful ways to engage female students with other aspects of what was happening. If you look at one of my a topic that interests me greatly, Army nurses, or for that matter, Navy nurses in the Pacific. If you look at the home front, and another part that's often kind of left out of the story by a lot of people in their minds, and Rosie the Riveter and these things. So I think that there are ways to do it. If D-Day itself may not engage as many females as it does males, World War II is an equal opportunity engager, I think.
Yeah, to quickly add, as a father of 4 daughters, I'm always constantly thinking about ways to, and doing new exhibits, how to think how they would interact, or what would appeal to them. But this recent exhibit we did on D-Day, which was I mentioned before, about using a tablet, a very interactive way of learning. I'm quite surprised at how many females are engaging with this story, right? Because some of the stories are and not just personal stories, but really interested in the tactics and the military side of things, because they are some way part of the experiences. You have to find certain things within the exhibit. You have to engage, and it's great to see that there are possibilities for younger audiences to learn about the D-Day story. We just got to figure out a way to connect with them. John mentioned video games and things like that. The challenge is is that video game violence is kids need to understand that this is not a fun thing, right? In reality, in terms of the violence that was displayed in not only D-Day but all wars, is a very tough and tragic thing to kind of comprehend. So to get away from that video game violence, but understand that how powerful that experience is for soldiers, for the families back home who will never ever get to see their loved ones again, enduring all that. I think that shift that happens, that kids and younger audience start to understand, okay, and because we, in terms of how service or enlistment in the military today is a lot different back than it was, obviously, during World War II. But I think there are many possibilities and many ways to connect new audiences on this story, not just interactive exhibits, but just talking. In this recent symposium we did, there was a youngster in the front row, just there for 4 or 5 hours, listening to historians talk about D-Day. So that in itself was amazing to see, and I think we're going to see more of it.
Hey, Charlotte, may I add something?
Yes, of course.
One of the things I mean about history being a living, breathing thing is how rewarding it is for people like us to have learned meticulous details about what happened in 1944 and have almost a real physical connection to the people today. Because you have become friends with children of the 29th Division veterans. And one of the most rewarding things I do is helping children and grandchildren of 29th Division veterans figure out what their ancestor did, because they generally have no idea. But even more than that, even though I'm retired now from my job in the military, I live this every day. And one of the things that I find really satisfying is when I can connect a family in Britain who was a child of a 29th Division soldier to their family in the United States, because sometimes they don't know they have a family in the United States. And I mean, to me, that's what I mean about history being a living, breathing thing. These men that we wrote about and loved and honor now, they had lives. And sometimes the product of that life was a new person and a whole new set of generations. And for me, and I did this just very recently, in fact, helping somebody in Britain to figure out how they are connected to relatives over here and what their 29th Division ancestor did on D-Day and in Normandy. As I said, sometimes you have down moments in the history field, but when something like that happens, you know that what you're doing is good, if you know what I mean. Helping people is, you never would have thought that in the history field that you'd get a very satisfying sense of continually helping people to understand their ancestors. And I get that every day. And been really the most rewarding aspect of my entire career. So.
I will second that also, not with connecting, a British family member with an American, but we get a lot of research questions every week, and it's, many of them just cannot be answered. We don't have the resources. The records were destroyed in the big fire back in 1973. The family doesn't know enough to get a starting point. Got a question not long ago about a relative who died in Normandy, but they only knew a first name. And it's kind of hard to track down someone just by the first name. And so, but at any rate, when I get one of those questions and we're able to answer it, it is very gratifying to know that I have helped this person, his or her family, make that connection back to 1944 and gain a greater understanding and appreciation of what Uncle Frank or great grandpa did in the war and why it's important. So it's it's too often that the answer is, I'm sorry, we just don't know. But boy, when you can't answer that question, it makes your day.
Thank you for sharing those answers. And, Joe and John, your last comments kind of bring me to my next question, which is the final moderated question for the night. So as we process the memory and meaning of D-Day, we do so as individuals and we also do so as communities. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about what it means to remember in private and then what it means to remember in public or in community with others. And I'd love to know what you see the role of museums, memorials, and historians in that process. And I mean, I think your thoughts about talking to individual families is relevant here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic.
Well, that's a great question, because remembering D-Day privately is one thing, and remembering it in a community sense is quite another. And I look back on my career and I'm a very, very lucky man. And when I reflect on D-Day in a private sense, I just have a satisfaction that I was able to do something in my life that was meaningful. Never made that much money, but I was I was happy, and when I reflect in moments of solitude, I think back to my parents, particularly my mother. My mother was a historian herself, and she gave me the bug. And I think, well, D-Day happened to be the thing that I would specialize in, but I get a great sense of satisfaction that subject matter was something that would have made my parents very happy that that they produced a child that was reasonably successful. In a community sense, you know, I mean, I've spent ever since my mid to late 20s, I've been a member of the 29th Infantry Division community, and I remain a member of the 29th Division Association right now, and that has been the means by which I generally remember the events. You know, as I was talking to John before the show, I'm going to be traveling down to the D-Day Memorial for the 80th anniversary, but I'm doing so in a capacity as a member of the 29th Division Association. We're sending a group of people down there, and it's very wonderful to me. I never served in the 29th Infantry Division, but to be able to represent this organization at a significant commemorative event that the public will attend is very satisfying to me. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but that's all that could pop into my mind. But thank you.
I think that's a good answer. Thank you.
I think being a memorial, you know, a big site with a lot of different components, we've seen both the public and the private memory playing out, and less common now because so many of the World War II veterans have passed on. But it wasn't uncommon, you know, not awfully long ago, to have a World War II veteran come and be moved to tears, remembering something that happened, or seeing the way his particular unit was represented on a plaque, or when he's taking a tour on a golf cart and school groups come up and want to shake his hand, and he's moved to tears over that. And we've heard many stories about Dad never talked about the war until we brought him to the D-Day Memorial, and it opened the floodgates, and now we know so much. So that's certainly rewarding experience, but we also remember it in public is also crucial, because every June 6th, and for that matter, we also have our annual gatherings on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, but every June 6th in particular, to gather together a large crowd from, depending on the year and the weather, a few hundred to several thousand people to remember, and to know that you're sharing that with a community of people who also recognize this important moment of history. But I do want to make one other point, kind of taking it in a different direction, because it's something I try to remind myself of so often, and I think it's lost sometimes when we talk about World War II or just war in general. We're really talking about a terrible subject. Maybe 70 million people died in this war. And I think we always have to be very careful not to lose sight of that what we consider to be a great moment in history and a great triumph and a victory to be celebrated was also just an absolute disaster for so many individuals. If we lose sight of that, if that 70 million becomes just a statistic that we kind of set aside, I think we've lost a big part of the story as well.
I mean, similar to my colleagues stated, as a museum, we're different than a memorial, right? We're here to sort of educate the public on the history and heritage of the United States Army. However, the exhibits, when it hits home for veterans and families, it can play that role, especially when the veterans come back. Honor flights, when they come to the museum, we make an announcement over the intercom to let folks know who's in the building, and it's amazing to see the response from the public, right? To want to just shake these folks' hands, to get a picture with them, just to talk with them briefly. And John mentioned that it's just an amazing experience for everybody. So I think it's important to recognize those veterans when they come to the museum. It's important, and mentioned a little bit before, when a family member comes to the museum wanting to donate an artifact, that even though you may have, hundreds of those types of artifacts, it's important to still listen to their story, because you'd be surprised what you can learn. You can be surprised what you can also share with them, and understanding their story, but also in connection to the object they're trying to donate. And in museums, our role is to do that. Our role is to capture those stories, whether it's through oral histories, whether it's through artifacts that are donated to the museum, whether it's figuring out ways to exhibit these materials in a very educational, but very engaging way. That's our responsibility to do that. So we do our best when we interact with visitors, but also folks who want to donate items. We take the time to listen. We take the time to follow up, because that's also an important process in terms of sort of public remembrance. And of course, as everyone mentioned, Veterans Day, Memorial Day, these commemorative days, it's important to have these public programs, these public events, to bring everybody in for a common cause.
Thank you all so much. Yes, I think, Kathleen, did you have something you wanted to share before we move on to the audience Q&A?
No, I was here to ask some of the questions that's been popping in.
Sounds great.
All right. The first one is actually for Mr. Long. It's about attendance at the National D-Day Memorial. The individual, Charlie Burry, was interested to know, how has attendance been? Has it been increasing, decreasing, and how has it been affected by COVID?
Well, you can probably imagine that COVID didn't do any favors to any museum anywhere, and I think Paul will endorse that idea. So we had a sharp drop off for a couple of years, but fortunately things have really turned around. Historically, we've been open since 2001, and historically every 5 or 0 anniversary, we see a spike, and so we anticipate that happening again this year. So attendance is good. I couldn't give you exact numbers without digging through the computer a little bit, but it has certainly recovered from the depths of the pandemic. Although we, as an outdoor venue, we actually were not as hurt as many other places. I'll hasten that, because you could still come to our site when other museums, had not yet opened up. But the other portion of that is we're getting a great response from schools. Just about every day we have available for school programs is taken. We're getting already some reservations, for the fall, and that, I think, is also a function of the fact that schools weren't allowed to do field trips for a while, and now that they can, they're taking advantage of it. But that's we're the education department, so that's what we like to see, in any given year.
Thank you. Now the questions are starting to pour in. Also, I do want to mention to everyone that there are a lot of good stories and thank yous and notes in the chat that I'll make sure that all the panelists receive, because a lot of these are thank yous for everything you do, and a lot to Joe for all the research assistance he's been offering. So a lot of great stories I'll be sure to share with everyone. The next question is actually for Joe from Charlie. He asks, what is your fondest memory of meeting a 29th D-Day veteran?
Oh boy, ooh, that's a tough one. The pressure's on. I think, I'm going to have to go back to the very first one because that's what started the ball rolling. I told you it was the 40th anniversary, 1984. And, sometime in the late 70s, the little pipe dream I had as a ambitious history major, I thought, someday I'm going to write a book about D-Day. Well, I lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and I lived only a couple of blocks away from the Armory, the 5th Regiment Armory, that at one time was the headquarters of the 29th Infantry Division. And little did I know at that time, at the age of 28, I guess, that I'd work for 3 decades in that building. Um, but I walked over to the Armory, and they were dedicating a 29th Division monument in front of the Armory that day. And this was my first introduction to the 29th Division veteran community. And the very first person I met became my mentor, my surrogate father. His name was John Pearlie Cooper, Jr. He was a lieutenant colonel on D-Day, gained a Silver Star. He commanded the 110th Field Artillery Battalion. And without him, I probably would have been, working in an insurance company right now. He took me under his wing. He somehow saw something in me. I don't know how he did, but he saw something in me. And for the next 3 or 4 years, I interviewed him every weekend. No tape recorders, just 2 guys talking about World War II. And he, as I said, he took me under his wing, and ultimately he said, "Joe, we can't tell our own story for reasons you probably understand, but somebody has to tell our story." And he, if that wasn't a message, I don't know what was. And I had a very good job at the think tank Booz Allen and Hamilton at that time, and due to this friendship, I quit that job. I don't know how I did. It was a well-paying job. And I signed a contract to write a book called Beyond the Beachhead. I got $1,000, and that was it as an advance. Took me 2 years. And anyway, short answer, John Pearlie Cooper was with me the whole time, and he's still with me. He died a week before the book came out. And of course, I dedicated the book to him. But without question, he is my favorite D-Day veteran and always will be. But good question, Charlie.
Yes, there's several comments in the chat you'll all have to read, and responses about having tearful memories, but good memories of individuals who are no longer with us. Now, there are a couple more questions. Some of them are longer than others. So if we don't get to your question during this program, I will forward them to the panelists and then give you their answer so that you can have it later, because some of these questions might need an entire new program. But here is one final question, and then we will let the panelists have their closing remarks before we close the program. This is for everyone. Have the D-Day veterans spoken about the combatants they faced, like the Germans? And is there any pattern of response?
I could share a thought on this. So Don McCarthy, who's one of the veterans featured in Sunken Roads, he's a 29er, shared a story of encountering a young German soldier shortly after D-Day, and just being struck with how young that soldier was and how human his face was. And they went their separate ways, and he tried after the war to find out who this man was, track him down, and never was able to. But it was an interesting thing for me to hear as a 20-year-old, Don reflecting on a experience that he had as a 20-year-old meeting someone who seems like was probably a teenager. And it's just a story that has stuck with me for a long time.
I can give a couple of generalities in my experience. Almost universally, every 29th Division veteran I met spoke, how should I say, with admiration for the fighting quality and tenacity of the Germans, which is not to say they admired them, but they always said that these people were the toughest SOBs that you could imagine. And it was brutal combat. But ironically, when I came to befriend them, and I just remark this as a matter of fact, that at reunions, you very, very rarely heard animosity anymore, in the 40, 50-year range. They did not carry the hatred that they had to have in order to survive in that brutality. They had let it go. And I just remark on that, and I was surprised by that, because I kind of thought that I myself, as a person who wasn't even alive, was expecting really harsh remarks about the enemy, and I very, very rarely got it.
I have been fortunate a couple of times, and I doubt it will ever happen again, but to be at a gathering or a symposium where there were American veterans and a German veteran, and to see that that animosity really had evaporated over the decades, is something touching. And I think you saw that after the Civil War also, when Union and Confederate veterans would get together and shake hands and whatever. Where I have not seen that a great deal is in the Pacific War. And I think that the attitude of American servicemen toward the Japanese enemy was much different than the German enemy. And that's a topic for another night, why that was. But I've in reading oral histories, talking to veterans, I've seen that firsthand quite a few times.
Okay, so now we'll give all the panelists final thoughts on the 80th anniversary for D-Day, and any other final thoughts they'd like to share before we close the program. Paul, I'll start with you.
Well, it's been great being part of this discussion, talking with everybody, and just learning so much from listening to John and Joe and Charlotte as well. I encourage to go out and commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Whatever local museum or where you can go to do that, whether it's publicly or privately, through films, through books. Of course, come out to the National Museum of the United States Army, go visit John's place and things like that. Just do something to honor what those soldiers did, and it could be just a small thing, and to continue kind of telling or learning about the story and also telling their stories, I think is the least we can do.
Next up is John.
Well, several people have told me I'm going to Normandy for the 80th anniversary, and if you have that opportunity, by all means, go. It's a great trip and a great time to be there. But if you're not, and you're in the vicinity of Bedford, certainly invite you to come by for our commemoration. The details are on our webpage, dday.org. We have a number of World War II veterans signed up. So far, the closest we've gotten to a D-Day veteran, well, I would consider this man a D-Day veteran anyways, a man who was aboard the Texas one of the 3 American battleships in the Channel. So at the battle, but not on the beaches. But most of the rest are just World War II veterans from other theaters or other battles. And you'll have the opportunity to hopefully at least meet some of those individuals, men and women. A couple of WACs, a WAC and a WAVE, I think, signed up at the moment. And certainly invite anyone, if you're able to get to Bedford, come on by. It's going to be a great day.
Joe?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This was fun. I will be with John at the D-Day Memorial, and I'm really looking forward to it for the 80th. So that will be wonderful. This is the first time I'm not going to be in Normandy for a big anniversary, but this will be great. And just in reflection, I wouldn't have changed anything in my career. I'm a very, very lucky man. I'm still incredulous that a young kid from New York City transferred to Baltimore, that I was accepted. I still can't believe it, that I was accepted by the men who had not ever opened their minds and their psyches yet. And I get chills when I think of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men that I've known. So this was a really nice event tonight for me to get chills again. So thank you.
And Charlotte?
Well, I want to thank you all for being here and sharing this space. In closing, I just want to thank the families of the veterans who were in Sunken Roads, including Ian McCarthy and Scott Earl and Fran Sher-Davino and others. It's great to see that you're here. And also to Charlie Burry, who's a 29er veteran, D-Day veteran. Thank you for being here. And I think in closing, I would just encourage folks to, attend to both the importance of private remembrance and public remembrance, right? Like, try to make it out and be part of a public D-Day commemoration this year, but also try to make an effort to spend time with those people in your family who either, maybe there aren't any World War II vets around in your family, but there are other people in your community who knew them personally and who might have stories to share and who'd be excited to take that time to talk. So yeah, I just encourage that too.
I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for all the panelists for coming together. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a good night.